Hey everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. Welcome to the channel. So today we were actually supposed to be seeing Black Widow, the first movie in Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the first movie in the series to come out in the post-Infinity Saga era. But things happened. Unpleasant things happened, so the movie got pushed to November, and hopefully it stays in November. And I know a lot of us are pretty bummed out about that, but you know what? Better safe than sorry. For the last decade, with the exception of 2014, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has always kicked off the summer, so it feels weird to have one summer without a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. But I need my fix. I'm sure you guys want an MCU fix as well, so this is the video that I'm going to be making. I'm going to be ranking all the movies in the Infinity Saga from my least favorite to my absolute favorite. Some of these might come across as a no-duh, considering that I talked about a lot of these movies in my top 100 list and my best of the decade list, but there might be some surprises here and there because, you know, opinions change. I might rank some of these movies here differently than I did before, but whatever the case, let's just hop into this video right now. Number 23, Iron Man 2. Let me first emphasize this. I think the worst MCU movie is just fine, like a 3 stars out of 5 type movie. And I don't even think Iron Man 2 is that bad, because it's got some really great action in it. Robert Downey Jr. once again delivers as Tony Stark. We get introduced to Don Cheadle as Rhodes, who I think is better than Terrence Howard. We get introduced to Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow. It's got some fun music. And Sam Rockwell as Justin Hammer is just having a blast in this role. What makes this movie the bottom of the list for me is all of the consistent arguments between Tony Stark and Pepper Potts. Every time these two characters argue with each other, it's just like nails on a chalkboard. It's irritating, it's unpleasant to watch, and I get the context, but it falls into this cliche of a lot of romantic comedies where characters don't talk things out, and thus there's a misunderstanding. And then another reason this is at the bottom of the list is because of Whiplash. Ivan Vanko is probably the worst MCU villain, or if anything else, he's probably the most petty villain. His motivation is just silly, and Mickey Rourke isn't even that good in the role, so that's a disappointment. So again, not a bad movie by any stretch, but it's just fine. Number 22, Thor: The Dark World. This movie is usually at the bottom of everyone's MCU ranking, and with good reason. It's not that imaginative, the action is just passable, it's kind of forgettable, all things considered, and Malekith is such a nondescript villain that you're kind of confused on what his actual motivation is. So why is this above Iron Man 2 for me? Well, a couple things. One, I think the handling of Frigga's death and funeral is very well done. It's very emotional, and that leads into a really heavy conversation between Loki and Thor when they flee Asgard and head to the planet of the Dark Elves. That conversation that these two have is just very gut-wrenching at points, and both Tom Hiddleston and Chris Hemsworth do a fantastic job. And also, because of the events of Endgame, this movie just has a little more going for it, but at the end of the day, it's still kind of a bland MCU movie, but at the very least, it didn't irritate me like Iron Man 2 did at points. Number 21, Thor. I actually like this movie quite a bit. I think it's a fun origin story for Thor. I love how the character goes from a cocky and selfish prince and just has to grow into the noble leader that he ends up being throughout the entire series. And Chris Hemsworth does a great job. We get our first introduction to Tom Hiddleston as Loki, who's great. The rest of the cast is pretty good as well. And compared to Thor: The Dark World, the humor isn't actually that bad. There are a lot of points in this movie that do make me laugh, but the reason why this movie is the third weakest film for me is mainly because a lot of the Dutch angles, some of the crappy CGI, and the fact that, while I think this movie is good, there are 20 other movies that are just better in my opinion. Number 20, The Incredible Hulk. I think this movie gets a really bad rep because it's pretty damn good, especially considering the last Hulk movie that came out before it. Even though I prefer Mark Ruffalo by a long shot as Bruce Banner, I think Ed Norton does a pretty damn good job in the role, and he looks more like what I imagined Bruce Banner to be. I love the opening of the movie in Brazil. The action scenes are a lot of fun, especially the big Hulk abomination fight in New York. The side characters, however, do kind of drag this movie down. Like, Liv Tyler as Betty Ross isn't that interesting, and Liv Tyler's not that good of an actor to begin with. William Hurt as Thunderbolt Ross is kind of sleepwalking through this movie, and I didn't quite understand Emil Blonsky's motivation outside of him just being power hungry. And this is just sort of a comic book nitpick, but I'm not a huge fan of the way that they just say in one sentence, yeah, Emil Blonsky was born in Russia, but he was raised in England, because Emil Blonsky is typically Russian, and Tim Roth doesn't do the accent. That's a nitpick, but overall, I think this movie is a lot better than people give it credit for. Number 19. Ant-Man. This movie actually gets a little better for me as time goes on, because when I first saw it, I was kind of in a negative mindset because I just thought to myself, man, what would this movie have been like if Edgar Wright had stayed on? But now that 5 years have gone by, and having rewatched this movie multiple times and just embracing it for what it is, it's a lot of fun. It's incredibly creative with its action scenes and the way it shows off the shrinking tech. Paul Rudd as Scott Lang is very charismatic. I love the dynamic he has with Michael Douglas as Hank Pym and Evangeline Lilly as Hope Van Dyne. The villain of the movie is pretty weak, but the movie's still a lot of fun, and it has a very fun, light heist nature to it, which I dig. Definitely an underappreciated movie in my opinion. Number 18. Ant-Man and the Wasp. I feel like I'm in the minority of people that thinks that this is actually better than the first Ant-Man, because everything that was really good about the first Ant-Man is pumped up even more in this one. The comedy is amped up, the shrinking and growing tech is more creative than the last movie, and it's really cool to see Hope Van Dyne kick ass as the Wasp, because it's usually hard for me to think of Ant-Man or the Wasp on their own. I usually think of these two together. The music's pretty great. I kind of do love the fact that there's no real true villain in this movie, and the fact that this is more of Hope's story than Scott's story is pretty cool, I think. And to top it all off, this is just a really nice and lighthearted palate cleanser after Infinity War came out and just wrecked everyone. So much like with Ant-Man and the Incredible Hulk, I think this movie is a lot better than people give it credit for. Number 17. Spider-Man Far From Home. I have to admit, I've only seen this movie once, when it came out in the theaters. And I remember liking it, but definitely not in love with it. The main reason this is in the lower tier of the MCU for me is because I think the first third of the movie is not particularly strong. It's not very funny, all things considered. And there's a lot about it that just feels relatively slow. But once the movie actually picks up, it picks up and becomes a damn good Spider-Man movie. Tom Holland once again delivers as Peter Parker / Spider-Man. I love how this movie is kind of an origin story in the sense that Spider-Man is learning to get away from the shadow of Iron Man because there can only be one Iron Man. And by the end of the movie, we get the Spider-Man that we all know and love. It's just a lot of fun. I would love to rewatch this movie again, and who knows, maybe this movie will bump up higher on the list than it did on my first watch. Number 16. Avengers: Age of Ultron. This movie is definitely, hands down, the worst of the Avengers movie, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It's got a lot of additional character development compared to the first Avengers movie. I love how at times it can get more personal. Like, the stuff on the farm is actually one of the best character moments throughout the entire series for a lot of these characters. The action's pretty sweet as well, and James Spader does a pretty damn good job as Ultron, and I'm one of the few people that thinks Ultron is kind of an intimidating villain. I mean, he's pretty much a precursor to what Thanos would eventually become, and he poses a true threat to the Avengers. That being said, it just doesn't carry that same spark that made the first Avengers movie so good, but in my opinion, still a really good movie regardless. Number 15. Iron Man 3. I actually love how that as time went on, more people are starting to appreciate Iron Man 3 a lot more because it's a really slick movie, more than Iron Man 2. Robert Downey Jr. once again delivers with this movie, and he knows how to work Shane Black's scripts. The action's fantastic. The score's really good by Brian Tyler. And I actually think the Mandarin twist is one of the most clever things in the movie. And hopefully I think people will give it a rest since we're going to get the true Mandarin with Shang-Chi. For the first movie to come out after the first Avengers movie, it's a hell of a film. And I also love how this is the movie where Tony Stark is stripped away from his Iron Man armor, but he continues to prove to us why he's badass without the armor. So again, it's really good, and I love how this movie has gotten more appreciated as time goes on. Number 14. Captain Marvel, the most controversial film in the entire franchise for the absolute dumbest reason possible. So dumb that I'm not even going to acknowledge it. I put this on number 15 in my best of list of 2019, and I'll stand by that statement because I think it's a really interesting way to tell the origin story without going through the same formula. I think Brie Larson does a really good job as Carol Danvers with what she's given. I love the dynamic between Carol Danvers and Nick Fury, and this is the most fun Samuel L. Jackson has ever had with this role. I actually dig Carol's story in this movie quite a bit, how she starts off as a Kree Star Force member, and then as she starts to learn more about her past, she realizes that the Kree were using her, and she just breaks free and becomes her own individual. I think that's a pretty cool message. Even so, it's got its problems. I'm not a big fan of the first few action sequences, especially the one in the subway, and the idea that Nick Fury loses his eye by Goose scratching his eye out is, I don't know, I still can't get over that. Maybe I could forgive it more if the way it was presented in the movie wasn't so sitcom-ish, but still, I think this movie is definitely, like I said before with other movies, better than it gets credit for. Number 13. Doctor Strange. Hands down, the weirdest movie in the entire franchise. And one movie that, when I first saw it, I didn't really appreciate that much. Then when I saw it again last year in prep for Endgame, I actually dug it a lot. I love Stephen Strange's story, and I love this introduction into the magical realm of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Benedict Cumberbatch is pretty great, and the rest of the supporting cast is pretty spot on as well. And I actually grew a bigger appreciation for Mads Mikkelsen as the film's villain. When you watch the movie for a second time, you really realize how tragic this villain actually is, and he's a precursor to what Doctor Strange could be if he'd gone the evil and selfish route. It's a movie that I really wish I had seen in IMAX 3D just because of how trippy it is in terms of its special effects, and I'm really happy that this is a movie that's gotten better as time goes on. Number 12. Guardians of the Galaxy. The biggest gamble that Marvel ever took, even with the billion-dollar success of the Avengers, and this film's success just proved that they could make a movie out of any one of their properties. Much like with Doctor Strange, this is a movie that I appreciate more as time goes on. It's a very funny movie, no question about it. The humor is top-notch. I love all the interactions between all the characters. Peter Quill, Gamora, Drax, Groot, and Rocket Raccoon. Every single one of the cast members does a spot-on job. And despite a lot of the film's goofier moments, it has a lot of heart to it, especially when it comes to the big "We Are Groot" scene. The fact that Vin Diesel can say those 3 words and make you feel something for that scene and what's going on is a true testament to how great this movie is. The only real problem with the movie is that Ronan is not a good villain at all. He's just kind of boring, he's generic, he's kind of petty, and he's overshadowed by Thanos' cameo, who pretty much breaks down why I don't like Ronan as a character, and by Nebula, who's a more interesting character than Ronan, and a character that I don't think anyone expected to last as long as she did. But still, despite that, this is a real winner in terms of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Number 11. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. This movie used to be my 3rd least favorite film in the series when I first saw it in theaters. But when I rewatched the movie last year, it suddenly jumped up to one of my absolute favorite films. and definitely one of the more personal films. It's not a movie that really sets up Infinity War. It's its own self-contained story, and because of that, it's a lot more personal. And everything that was good or not very good in the first movie is actually better in this one. I love the soundtrack of this movie a lot better. It's a more beautiful looking movie. Ego is a much better villain than Ronan, and plus Kurt Russell is just more charismatic in my opinion. I love the theme of the movie where everyone has to put aside their ego because all it ends up doing is hurting people. And if you don't find yourself crying by the end of this movie, then you have no soul. It'll make you laugh, it'll make you cheer, as I said, it'll make you cry, and it's definitely one of the top tier MCU films. Number 10. Thor Ragnarok. Hands down the best of the Thor movies. And not only that, it's the movie that Thor needed, and it's probably the most comic book movie out there, just in terms of its color palette, the way shots are framed. Hiring Taika Waititi to make this movie was probably the best decision Marvel had made for this character. It's also the funniest movie of the entire franchise. Every time I watch this movie, the most subtle thing that's supposed to be a joke makes me laugh harder than I probably should. Like our introduction to Valkyrie, where she drunkenly falls into garbage on Sakaar, when Thor and Loki head to New York and they find out that the old folks' home that Loki dumped Odin in is being demolished. The entire sequence with Doctor Strange, and it's definitely got the most comedic one-liners throughout the movie. Or just comedic conversations overall. The action's great, more inspired than in Thor the Dark World. The score by Mark Mothersbaugh is fantastic. I love all the new characters introduced in this movie. It's got some great Jack Kirby-inspired production design, and it's actually surprisingly emotional considering that this movie's a straight-up comedy. It makes me excited for Thor Love and Thunder and anything else that Taika Waititi makes. Number 9. Spider-Man Homecoming. Between Logan, Lego Batman, Wonder Woman, Thor Ragnarok, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and Spider-Man Homecoming, 2017 was hands down the best year for comic book movies in the last decade. And Spider-Man Homecoming, while not better than Logan, is definitely my favorite of the MCU movies that year. Spider-Man's first solo outing into the Marvel Cinematic Universe is just so good. It's definitely a different Spider-Man movie compared to the ones we got before. I love how high school is the main focus of this film, and it plays out like if John Hughes made a superhero movie. Despite all of these very comic book elements in the movie, the characters feel very real, the relationships and chemistry between all the characters is believable, and I also love that Adrian Toomes is a very sympathetic villain, and you understand why he's doing what he's doing. Michael Keaton does a really great job in this role, and the big twist of the movie is just so awesome that I still remember when the entire audience was kind of nervous laughing when the twist was revealed. It's just a great movie all around, and it's hands down my favorite live-action Spider-Man movie. Number 8. Captain America: The First Avenger. I love this movie a lot and truly don't understand why a lot of people out there don't. Not only is this a very fun superhero movie set in World War II, but I also think it's one of the better origin story movies to come out because you really get an emphasis on why Steve Rogers was picked to be in the Super Soldier program. You get to see that he is just truly a good man. He wants to stand up and do what's right no matter what the cost. And he stands up for what he believes in. He's just a guy who doesn't like bullies, and he is dedicated to his own cause. Chris Evans is amazing in this role, and he embodies Steve Rogers, Captain America, the same way Christopher Reeves embodies Superman. And in my opinion, this interpretation of Captain America is pretty much the 21st century equivalent of Christopher Reeves' Superman. The rest of the supporting cast is great. Haley Atwell as Peggy Carter is fantastic, and I love how this character has gotten more to do throughout the rest of the series, whether it's in other movies or in TV. Tommy Lee Jones is a lot of fun. Sebastian Stan as Bucky Barnes is pretty good. Stanley Tucci is fantastic as well. And I even dig Hugo Weaving's Red Skull. He might come across as cartoonish at points, but I think Red Skull is actually one of the better MCU villains. A great comic book movie with the only problem that it has being that it's overshadowed by its 2 sequels, which we'll get to soon. Number 7. Black Panther. By the time this movie came out, it was no surprise that whatever Marvel put out was going to be a big hit. But I don't think anybody expected Black Panther to be the massive phenomenon that it ended up being, and I think it's a well-deserved phenomenon. Much like with Guardians of the Galaxy, this movie explores an area of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that is almost otherworldly. Wakanda is incredibly well developed as a nation, and you kind of wish that this place was not only real, but you also wish that more world governments would kind of act like Wakanda. Chadwick Boseman as King T'Challa is fantastic. Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger is one of the best villains in the entire franchise. And there's definitely a lot of sympathy to be had with this character to begin with. And I love the rest of the supporting characters. Nakia, Okoye, Shuri. The look of Wakanda is just fantastic as well, from the production design, the costumes, and then the score is just fantastic. There's a reason why this movie won Oscars in all three of those categories. The only bad thing about this movie are the special effects, especially the rhinos, which look terrible. But what this movie gets right, it gets damn right, enough for me to look past the special effects. And there's definitely a reason why this movie is the phenomenon that it is. Number 6. Avengers Infinity War. I know in my best of the decade list, I put Infinity War and Endgame together, but if I'm ranking each individual Marvel Cinematic Universe film, this is honestly my least favorite of the Russo brothers movies, but that's not saying a whole lot because it's still excellent in its own right. It manages to recapture the spark that the first Avengers had by bringing the Guardians of the Galaxy into the fray, and the decision to make the movie's main focus be on Thanos was a very good decision. Thanos is given a lot of character development in this movie. We get to understand his motivation, even if it's very, very misguided now that you watch Avengers Endgame. Josh Brolin is very menacing, and he just gives gravitas to Thanos, mainly with that voice. The action's exciting. It's definitely got a huge scope to it. It's fun to see all these characters come together for the first time and see the Guardians of the Galaxy interact with the Avengers, Stephen Strange interact with Tony Stark, having Peter Parker officially become an Avenger. And even though we could pretty much tell that a lot of the characters that got snapped away will be coming back in the next movie, it's still pretty effective when you watch it happen. Again, it's my least favorite of the Russo's MCU films, and I know I'm in the minority for saying that, but it's still amazing regardless. Number 5. Iron Man, the one that started it all. It's so weird to watch Avengers Endgame and then go back to the first Iron Man and see how relatively tame it is by comparison. It's not very exaggerated, it's not very comic bookish, it feels very grounded, and this was actually a movie that I was dreading to watch. I thought it was going to be terrible, especially considering that 2007 we had the 1-2-3 punch of Ghost Rider, Spider-Man 3, and Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, so I just naturally assumed that this movie wasn't going to be good, and holy crap is it awesome. Hiring Robert Downey Jr. to play Tony Stark was one of those perfect choices, and the rest of the cast is great. Gwyneth Paltrow, Jeff Bridges, and even though I said I prefer Don Cheadle as Rhodes, Terrence Howard is really charismatic in this role as well, and it's interesting to think what would have happened if Terrence Howard had stayed in this role and not gotten replaced. The most negative thing I can say about this movie is that the climax is not very climactic, it's just kind of there. And the action scene where Tony Stark escapes from that cave in the Mark I armor is actually a lot better. But even then, regardless of the big final battle being not too climactic, still a fantastic movie in its own right. Number 4. Captain America: The Winter Soldier. The first film in the franchise to be directed by Joe and Anthony Russo, and the movie that changed everything in the franchise. I had already loved Captain America from the first Avenger and the Avengers, but this is the movie that really emphasized why Steve Rogers is a badass character, because despite being in different times, he doesn't give up on his ideals. The world's changed around him, but that doesn't mean he has to change either. Chris Evans once again nails this role. Scarlett Johansson as Natasha Romanoff has a lot more to do in this movie, and she's a more fleshed out character in this movie than she was in her first 2 appearances. Robert Redford as Alexander Pierce makes for a fantastic villain. Sebastian Stan returns as the Winter Soldier, and he's pretty intimidating. Samuel Jackson as Nick Fury is awesome in this movie. Probably my favorite of Nick Fury's appearances. And the action scenes are just jaw-droppingly amazing, especially the one in the elevator. This movie is often regarded as the best of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it might be the best made, but given that it's number 4, it's not my favorite, but still, I adore this movie. I absolutely adore it. Number 3, Captain America Civil War. This is the movie that I hear a lot of people say is their least favorite of the Russo's MCU films. And the reason I like this movie above Winter Soldier, just slightly above, is that it's a more complex movie when dealing with our heroes. There's no real clear-cut villain or hero in this movie. You could watch this movie countless times, and you'll be swayed between who's right and who's wrong. Because both sides, Team Iron Man or Team Captain America, deliver valid points. Steve Rogers once again is put to another test to where he can't and won't give up his ideals. Tony Stark is the most mature we've seen him since the first Iron Man movie, and the actual film's villain is sympathetic in his own right, and you can get why he's doing what he's doing. You don't approve of it, but at least there's a reason. And it makes me so happy that Zemo's coming back in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because there is a lot more to be done with this character. And then, of course, I can't talk about this movie without mentioning the awesome airport battle, the introductions to both Black Panther and Spider-Man into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The first time you see Queens, New York, and Left Hand Free starts playing, you know that we are getting our first introduction to the Marvel Cinematic Universe Spider-Man, and I'll never forget the day everyone loved that moment. Civil War is definitely a long movie, and it's definitely not one of the most rewatchable MCU movies, but because this movie itself has so many fantastic and complex themes that another movie could have learned from, that's why it's at number 3 for me. Number 2, Marvel's The Avengers. This is probably the most rewatchable movie in the entire franchise for me. This was such a big event when it came out. Nobody had ever seen any movie like this. I mean, yeah, there were cartoons and direct-to-video movies that were animated of the Avengers, but never had a live-action Avengers movie been attempted before, let alone with several other movies leading up to this one. And boy, was it a hell of a payoff. Joss Whedon's direction and script in this movie is definitely spot on. All the actors do a fantastic job. Getting to see Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, and Thor interact with each other for the first time is just a fan's dream come true. The action is amazing. The score by Alan Silvestri is fantastic, and the Avengers theme itself ranks up there with John Williams' Superman theme and Danny Elfman's Batman theme. When this movie came out in theaters, I saw it 6 times, and I just kept rewatching it on Blu-ray when I bought it, and I was obsessed with this movie the year it came out. I make it a point every year to watch this movie because it's just so well done. If this movie had been bad, then everything leading up to this film would have been for nothing, but thank God it was, and this was truly a history in the making type of movie. And now we come to the number 1 movie, which is a no surprise at all. It really isn't. Let's just get into it. Number 1. Avengers Endgame. I absolutely adore the first Avengers movie, and I liked a lot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but this is my favorite of the entire franchise, because this was the movie that everything else prior to it was building up to. This was the big plan that they had set up from the beginning, ever since Nick Fury walked into Tony Stark's apartment, and ever since we got our first glimpse of Thanos at the end of the Avengers. And as I said with the first Avengers, if this movie had failed, then everything leading up to it would have been for nothing, but man, did they stick their landing. Not only does it have everything you love from the rest of the franchise, the great humor, the fantastic action, and the great character moments, but for my money, this movie tells the most human story of the entire franchise. All these characters are given a second chance to undo what happened in Infinity War, and they know it's a tough road ahead, they know there's a lot at risk, and a lot of these characters are either psychologically or physically damaged from what happened in Infinity War. but still, they make it a priority to get everyone back, whatever it takes. And all the fan service in this movie that some people complain about, sure, it's fan service, but it all leads up to satisfying character moments. Steve Rogers showing that he is worthy of Mjolnir and he is not a laboratory experiment that Tony Stark has labeled him as. Hope making fun of Scott in Ant-Man and the Wasp for calling Captain America Cap when she calls him that herself. T'Challa not caring to learn Clint Barton's name in Civil War only to learn it in this movie. Tony Stark giving Peter Parker that hug that he rejected in Spider-Man Homecoming. There's a lot of fan service in here that actually builds up to very great and sweet character moments. And this is also my favorite theater going experience. Seeing this movie for the first time was something I'll never forget, even if it was a press screening. The portal scene is epic, it's emotional. Hearing Steve Rogers say Avengers Assemble was well earned. Everything that this movie does was earned. It's not forced, it doesn't feel fake like in The Rise of Skywalker. It's well deserved. And it's a hell of an ending. And this movie holds the personal distinction of being the only 3-hour movie that I've watched where it doesn't feel like 3 hours. This movie goes by incredibly fast, and there's never a second wasted. I absolutely adore Avengers Endgame, and it's because of all those reasons that I listed beforehand why it's my favorite in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. And there you go, that's my ranking of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. I hope you enjoyed it. And now I want to know what you guys think about my ranking. Do you agree or disagree with the majority of this ranking? What's your personal MCU ranking? And also I should point out that I will be doing a live watch-along for the Godzilla franchise starting next week, but once the Godzilla series is done, I will be doing live watch-alongs for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So definitely keep your eyes open for that. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, leave a comment, support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until then, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.